Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is religious extremism. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about religious extremism, Alana McLaughlin. And of course, Alana, let me welcome you to the show this morning and to have you to give our audience some information in reference to your background, education, and your experiences. And I think that certainly you're no stranger to what we do here, and you've been with us since you were, what, 7 or 8 years old? Mm-hmm. And so this might be your is it about your fifth year with us, fifth or sixth year with us? And seventh year with us. The time really flies. But what we want to do today is to talk about religious extremism, and you said that it was a topic that you would like to discuss this morning, and we want to give you an opportunity to do that. But before we do that, let's have you to give our audience, for those who might not know some of the things that you've been involved with, let's have you to give our audience sort of a review of your background, your education, and some of your experiences during this first segment. And then during the second segment, we'll have an opportunity to get into the topic, religious extremism, later on. Let's do it that way.
Well, like you stated, my name is Alana McLaughlin. I am a sophomore at the Nashville School of Arts, where I specialize in the band conservatory, where I play trumpet. I march for Pearl Cone's marching band, and I'm very big on academics and the instruments. I go to a school that's, you know, very big on music. Some of my background includes I've played for Lady Antebellum at Bridgestone Arena before with some of my fellow classmates at the Nashville School of Arts. I'm just heavily involved in academics in my church, John Wesley United Methodist Church, and I've been on various leadership camps and groups, including the summer camp for verbally and mathematically precocious youth at the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University, and the Junior National Young Leaders Conference in Washington, D.C.
And so in a real sense, you've been involved quite a bit, dealing with a large number of things since we first started here. And I think you must have been, what, about 6 years old when we first started, 5 or 6 years old when we first started. And now we have an opportunity to meet you as a sophomore at the Nashville School of Arts, and we're certainly delighted to have you here. Now, the topic religious extremism, what do you mean when you talk about religious extremism, Lana?
Religious extremism is a term that describes faith-based acts of terror, whether it be causing harm to someone, like, you know, bombing their house, or doing things like, you know, bullying someone, just acts of terror. And religious extremism is not to be confused with religious fundamentalism, which is where people interpret a holy word or take their faith so seriously that it becomes scary. For instance, an example of religious fundamentalism would be the snake handlers of Appalachia. These are people in the Appalachians who believe that the Bible says that we should take up serpents, so they literally take up serpents. A part of their day-to-day worship is snake handling. And
they call that snake worshiping. Is that what?
Well, they call it snake handling. But they do it because they say that the Bible says that we should, you know, take up serpents. That's an example of fundamentalism. That not all cases of religious fundamentalism hurt people, but the snake handlers have been bitten and have died from that. Religious extremism is almost always violent, and it is things like, for instance, 9/11, the terror attacks on the World Trade Center. That's an example of religious extremism. Someone doing something that was based upon their faith to cause terror and to hurt other people, which would be killing the people in New York City. These two things are commonly confused, but in the next segment I'll be getting more into the differences and why both of these things are very scary.
And so you think that this is something that our audience ought to know this more. Why should they know something about this?
Because, like, how should I word this? Every day we see more examples of religious extremism, and we need to be aware of what this is and how to protect ourselves and how to know the signs of a religious extremist.
Because that plays such a crucial part in terms of
church bombings, terror attacks. We need to be more aware of this because this is something that's becoming very prevalent in our society.
And well, so what we'll do, we'll take a our first commercial break. And then we'll come back and we'll have about 8 minutes, and we'll give you an opportunity to talk about some aspects of religious extremism. And I think that you've got a plan to cover many continents and whatnot and bring a number of things into view. And so we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Who's the principal?
Gregory Stewart.
Okay.
Gregory Stewart. Mm-hmm.
Was he there when you were there?
He was not. I had Bob Wilson.
Wilson. Mm-hmm. What conservatory were you in?
Media. Yeah.
Awesome.
So I'm not sure if that's still there.
I don't think so. They might have turned like theater media or media audio.
Film, TV.
They
kind of called it mass comm, but also media. And we just, you know.
They combined it with theater so that there's they call it tech, but it's a branch of theater. So yeah.
Okay, great.
Very good. Okay, so and so you're practicing something that you learned at the Nashville School of Arts, an inspiration from there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. When I went, it was just starting. So if I can be truthful, it's just oh goodness.
It was all right,
hard
but now
to
it's,
say,
yeah.
but,
Very good.
they didn't really have structure.
Yeah, NSA is really great, but it's also very.
Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's given us some information in reference to religious extremism. And of course, Alana, let's see if we can pick up where we left off the first segment and give you at least 8 minutes to be specific in reference to some of the religious extremes that you would like our audience to know about this morning, and the impact that these extremes have on the American population or the world population in a real sense.
Well, for our viewers just tuning in the last segment I introduced myself, I talked a bit about my background in education, but I also got into what religious extremism is. And it is a term that describes faith-based acts of terrorism. And acts of terrorism span everything from murder, rape, kidnapping, acts of terror. And I also talked about the difference between religious extremism and religious fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism is where you're taking a religion's views or a holy word so literally that it could be dangerous, but most cases of religious fundamentalism aren't very dangerous. For instance, the snake handlers of Appalachia, which is here in Tennessee. In the Appalachian Mountains, there are a group of people who do their church services with serpents, with snakes, because in the Bible it does say that we should take up serpents, but I don't think that they meant it literally. But a religious fundamentalist would take that literally, and that's what they do. They handle snakes, and that's a part of their culture, basically. Now, diving deeper into religious extremism comes in it spans all continents, and it comes in every shape or form, in every skin color, every ethnicity, every culture. An example, now usually we see religious extremist groups in religions such as Islam, but we don't really talk about Christian or extremist groups in Judaism or in Buddhism, because mainly Christian religious extremist groups and Jewish extremist groups that took place more in the older days, more back in the day, you could say. And the more modern examples of religious extremism that we see do come from Islam, but there's no correlation between Islamic people and that. It's just something that we just see more often. But not to say that there aren't, still Christian extremist groups, because there are. We just don't really hear about them as much as we do, say, Boko Haram or ISIS. An example of a Christian extremist group would definitely be the Army of God. Now, these people are comparable to the more popular Westboro Baptist Church, which is a church, it's like a family, and they go around, they picket army funerals and funerals of, say, Black Lives Matter protesters or gay people, or they go and they picket, you know, abortion clinics. That's an example of religious extremism, because those people are saying hateful things like, oh, you should die, or you should go this place and that place. But the Army of God is primarily very anti-abortion, and they are known to do things like blow up abortion clinics like Planned Parenthood and things like that. But we don't really see this as much in the news, well, at least in the United States. And you have to really think, why is that? Because if you turn on CNN or Fox, you always see, oh, ISIS did this and Boko Haram did this, when they are both very bad groups, and we need coverage on both, because, you know, the Army of God is happening right under our noses, you know? And so most people don't really know that there are Christian extremist groups, because they think, oh, Christians don't really have a reason to be extremists, you know, nothing's going on with them. Most people think that there are only Islamic extremist groups, and that extremist groups only live in, you know, Africa or Europe, you know, continents like that. But that's definitely not true. The Southern Poverty Law Center released a list, and it has this names and names and names of United States religious extremist groups that we never hear about. The Army of God and the Westboro Baptist Church being the most popular. That's why I'm using those two as my examples, because people have probably heard about them, really, you know, skimmed over an article about them, but don't really know about them. Now, the more dangerous and the more prevalent groups, I would say, would definitely be groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. These are Islamic terrorist groups, extremist groups, and they do things like, you know, bomb people, behead people, kill people, but they claim that they're doing this as a faith-based thing. And when you really delve deep into religious extremism, you come to a point where you're sitting and you're reading about this and you think, now, in your head, and you and I, we see this and we think, oh, it's bad. You know, these people deserve to be, you know, in prison or whatever. But you also have to think about it in their shoes. They're doing this because someone was behind them saying, oh, you need to do this for our faith, for your religion. And most heavily religious people would go to great lengths to spread their religion. You know, that's a type of diffusion. But you come to the point where you're like, all right, are these people, is it justified that they're doing it because of their religion, or is it still terror? And that's a big question. You know, who are we to judge? The God or the gods in the religion that they're doing this religious extremist actions for is the person to judge. And that's what makes this topic so interesting, because there's no definite this is good or this is bad, because no one can really tell, because what they're doing is justified. And you know, in you and I's opinion, they shouldn't be doing it, but it is still justified.
That is, it depends on who you are in terms of how you will evaluate what they are doing. It's something like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Yes,
exactly. It just depends on who you ask. Now, you and I discussing this, we're like, okay, they're just bad. We need to just get rid of them. But when you think about it from their point of view, they're doing this because of their faith. And you can't really sit up and tell someone to stop doing something because of their faith, because faith is, in religion, is probably one of the strongest factors that brings people together. For instance, you know, church, mass, mosques, pilgrimages, all these things bring people together. It's a lifestyle. And you can't tell someone to break away from what they've known. And people in religious extremist groups, it's not really just strangers coming together. You know, this will be brothers, sisters, mothers and fathers, uncles, aunts. These are people who grew up with these views. And that's another thing you have to consider when you're talking about, say, the Westboro Baptist Church. These people didn't just wake up one day and decide to just be hateful. They had this preached to them. Their mothers and fathers probably believed in what they're preaching, and that's the way they grew up. So the things that they do are justified in there. I personally do not believe they're good, but everything has a reasoning.
Very good. And so what we'll do, Lana, We'll take this second commercial break, and then we'll come back for our final segment, which will give you about 10 minutes to sort of round this out. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. We'll deal with that for 10 minutes. We'll start.
And I can see where it takes. And I can talk about extremist events in history.
Okay. And you just talk about the one that started you off, 9/11, because that was the first
9/11, Papa. Don't say 9/11.
That was the first show that you did with us, the attack on America, you see. And then if you want to, and then, talk about it from that perspective, sort of reflect on some of the things that we've done or that you know, or whatever.
Ready?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, awesome. They're ready.
Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's giving us some information relative to religious extremism. And of course, Alana, let's take this final segment to be more specific, dealing with some of the more extreme religious groups that our audience might be aware of this morning. As a matter of fact, I think you already mentioned Boko Haram and ISIS. And so if we could simply devote much of this last segment to say as much as we possibly can about these two religious extreme groups, and to make people who might be in your age group well aware of the significance of these groups and why they are important.
Well, when people hear the term religious extremism, they're usually taken aback a bit. They're not familiar with it because we don't really use the term that much. We use terms like terrorism and terrorist groups, terrorist attacks. And most people, if you say, name a religious extremism event that really shook the population, most would be puzzled. But there are lots that we're definitely aware of that we don't really, well, that we do talk about, but we just don't use the term religious extremism
when we talk about them.
An example would be 9/11, the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. The people who drove those planes into those towers were religious extremists. They were also very mentally ill, and they were suicide pilots, but nevertheless, that was a religious extremist event. And it was in retaliation to the United States going to their Holy Land and setting up bases for, say, war and things of such, and disgracing their Holy Land. So people from the Holy Land, which would be, Saudi Arabia, Islamic countries, came over and decided that we're not going to let this happen. We're going to rock them. We're going to scare them. We're going to try to silence them. And that's what prompted 9/11. Another example of religious extremist events would be the church shootings that have been going on. Say there was one here in Nashville and the one in Texas. But things like this are, you have to really think about them, and you have to get all your facts straight, because they could be interpreted two ways. It could either be religious extremism or mental illness. Now, personally, I believe that the one in Nashville was mental illness, because I don't think that the man was just some religious extremist Christian who wanted to just kill other Christians. I believe that this was truly a mentally ill person who wanted to hurt other people. But 9/11 is definitely religious extremism, because it was prompted by a religious extremist group who came from a country that had been scorned by the United States, and they wanted to retaliate. Other examples of religious extremism events would be the Parisian bombings, the attacks over there. That is another one that was by a religious extremist group that was in retaliation for something that rubbed them wrong, that involved their religion. And like I said in the last segment, when you think about these things, you have to think about them long and hard, because you can sit up and tell them that they're wrong, and they are wrong for killing people, but at the same time, you have to understand why people do the things that they do, and that these are probably people who would be normal under any other circumstance, but they grew up being pushed into terrorist groups, because like I said, a lot of times these groups are mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, family members, or people who grew up together. People don't just wake up and want to be a terrorist. They grew up around these things, so they're doing doing the only thing that they know.
That they think that their religion requires them to do.
To reach whatever holy land or whatever holy awarding they want. This is the reason that they do those things. And we look at it and we're so quick to judge them, but we have to think, what would you do? If you grew up in a household, you're Christian, say you grew up in a Christian extremist household that said that, oh, you have to kill atheists to go to heaven, or God won't be happy until you bomb abortion clinics like the Army of God, or until you picket soldiers' funerals because God hates war, like the Westboro Baptist Church says. What if you grew up like that and went and did all those things? You don't see anything wrong with it.
Because that's your what? You're growing up.
That's your culture, basically. That's what makes you who you are. And outsiders are so quick to judge this, but we need to learn more about these people, and we need to teach more acceptance of people, and we need to teach about other cultures and how not every culture and not every person is bad. Because a lot of times these religious extremist groups they're born when someone is rubbed wrong by a different religion, and this enrages them, and they preach hateful words about said religion, and it gets so violent that it turns into an extremist group. The Westboro Baptist Church, for instance, one of them was probably scorned by a soldier, and they went on to say, oh, God hates war and God hates soldiers. Or they were probably scorned by a gay person and believed that all gay people are just bad. Now, like I was saying in the last segment, I talked about religious fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is when you interpret the Bible so literally that it becomes an issue. It becomes a bit scary. Like I said, the snake handlers of Appalachia, they handle snakes because they read in the Bible that we should take up serpents. The Westboro Baptist Church, hating members of the LGBTQ plus community, which is lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, and queer, and etc. They take from the Bible, which is the holy word of Christianity, they take from this that homosexuality is a sin. And from that, anything related to homosexuality, which they believe is being bisexual or transgender or just queer in general, they take all of this as sin. And because of that, they take this, and what brings them from fundamentalists, which is just believing that it's a sin, to extremists, which is really acting against them, is their acts of terror. The Westboro Baptist Church, had they not gone out and picketed or bombed or threatened all these people, their beliefs would just make them a religious fundamentalist group. But them going into action with these things and going above and beyond to hurt other people makes them a terrorist group, an extremist group. And what's so crazy about them is that they're here in the United States, and we hear the least coverage of them out of Boko Haram and ISIS and the Army of God. We don't hear about the Westboro Baptist Church as much as we do other terrorist groups. But they're right here in our own country. And so I believe that we should teach more awareness of these groups, and we should also teach acceptance and kindness and love, because these people grew up without those things, and they grew up with hateful people in hateful households, and they grew up to be hateful people who wanted to spread their hateful word.
And so, Alana, it seems to me that you have been so concerned in terms of these various groups. What do you think in terms of how we might be able to make other people understand what these groups are, not only the way we're explaining today, but to make others have more tolerance, perhaps, at these extreme groups, and to be able to understand them?
You can never really teach people unless they would like to be taught. I believe that when you're trying to teach people who want to be taught about these groups, and let them know why they do what they do, where they do what they do, and why it isn't bad. Tell them that, you know, Boko Haram is predominantly in Chad, in the continent of Africa. And places like the Army of God and the Westboro Baptist Church are primarily in the United States. Let them know what their beliefs are, why they believe this, and teach them, and teach the people who want to be taught that this is not okay. Religious extremism is not okay. Using faith as an excuse to be hateful is not okay. Because religion should bring people together, not tear people down or tear people apart. That's almost the opposite of all the views of most big religions, you know, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam. It's to bring people together, to love and to worship either your God or your many gods, depending on if you're monotheistic or polytheistic. The objective is to bring people together, and people just fail to realize that.
Okay, so Alana, let me thank you for this excellent overview of religious fundamentalism this morning, and I'm sure that our audience was able to pull out of it the information that they wanted to pull out of it. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.